Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So as I hear, this is the third session post-lunch, so it's the ultra snooze session. And the topic is urban response. So we're going to try and get as much response from you as possible. The way the format, now we've decided to set it up because the three speakers are going to be speaking about very different topics around city building, urban planning, etc. So we're going to have each of the speakers present for 10 minutes. And we're going to have a Q&A at the end with your participation. So please listen in. First up, we have Amitabh Kant, who's the CEO and MD of Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. He's also the key architect of Incredible India and God's Own Country campaigns. Amitabh, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Ram. Design in many ways touches the lives of all of us. And we are all designers in many ways. And intentionally or unintentionally, we tend to have an impact. But for me, design has to be necessarily interwoven with the social fabric. It has to be simple. It has to be straight. And in many ways, pretty straightforward. And I'll try and present two case studies. One is, and these are both experiential. One is what we tried to do in the world of tourism. And one is what I'm trying to do now. One was really about making India incredible, and the other is about making incredible India more credible. And I'll start with when I joined Ministry of Tourism. Tourism at that time, the image perception of India was pretty low. It was extremely low in a World Travel and Tourism Council survey, as you'd see here. But it also showed that India was extremely rich in terms of culture, heritage, and it had a huge potential. It had authenticity, it had history, it had art and culture. And well-designed, promoted, marketed campaign could make India one of the highest drivers of growth between 2008 and 18. And that time, our intention was to really make tourism the major engine, one of the key drivers of economic growth. And some of my experiences were based around Kerala, which was a small strip of land. But at that point of time, Kerala was essentially known as a single product destination, the beach. We switched over to completely new products, totally designed for tourism. One was the backwaters of Kerala, which nobody in the world had heard of at that point of time. We formulated this houseboat, which was then the traditional rice boat of Kerala, on which rice used to be transported, on which not a single nail is used. Actually, carpenters had gone away to Gulf. They came back, and today close to about 160-odd houseboats operate in backwaters. We brought back the traditional time-tested system of Indian medicine, which dated back to 600 BC. The Ayurveda made it more sophisticated, more refined, and this is one of the unique products of that destination. But the key thing was that when you're promoting and a destination, it's very important that you differentiate. And designing, to my mind, is very critically linked with differentiation of a product. And we went back, instead of aping the West, we went back to the traditional roots. And our product was designed around the traditional strengths of Kerala. Its cultural heritage, its Mohiniyattam, its Kathakali, its traditional elephant pageants, its traditional boat races, Tiger Trail, a unique product that was designed where we converted poachers into guides into the Periyar Game Sanctuary, and designed a unique product called the Tree Huts of Kerala, brought back the traditional martial arts of Kerala, and brought back the traditional cuisine. So this was about designing a completely new destination of Kerala. And Kerala then went back to be discovered as one of the unique paradises found by the National Geographic Traveler as one of the 10 exotic paradises of the world. But to me, to be really powerful, a design must express itself not in terms of sheer product benefit, but in terms of its greater socio-economic strength. And when we moved over to Incredible India, we again, for us, the challenge was that how do you make tourism as a key driver of growth? And the campaign, as you'll see here, the designing was all around the play of the word I, with the stripe of the tiger, with the shade, with the sun rays falling on the mountains, this lady in the deserts of Rajasthan, the yoga of India, And we went back again to the roots of India around its yoga, its Ayurveda, its in the Himalayas, its reflexography in the deserts of Rajasthan, and again, Ayurveda in the backwaters of Kerala. Every year we did new designing of campaign, new creativity we brought in through the colors, through the vibrancy of India's color, get rid of 21st century stress, stand for 5,000 years, and tried to bring in a little bit of this tiger, and we said not all Indians are polite, hospitable, and vegetarian. And we also had this great campaign around the Taj, we said around Buddhism, and we said around adventure, don't panic, there's always rebirth. Now, there was a lot of creativity, but the key element there was that we worked with a lot of very creative talents. We did a lot of unique things around. But then, you know, it's not about advertising. Designing is not about advertising. It's about the experience. And here, the important thing was to improve the quality of experience on ground. So there was Ajanta, which we improved, brought in eco-friendly buses, brought in greenery, improved the conservation, preservation. Hardwar, the ghats before, the after, just to improve the quality of experience. The Mahabalipuram, what we did in terms of experiences, in terms of the lighting, in terms of the heritage, or the Delhi monuments, in terms of what was done to the Humayun tomb and to many other monuments in terms of the lighting. But I think the key challenge for India is really if 350 million people are going to get into the urban process by 2030, if 700 million people are going to get into the urban process by 2050, if India doesn't create new cities, every single city will be a slum. Now, the challenge is that you cannot follow the American model, because American model was made at a point of time when land, gas, and water were cheaply available. And therefore, American cities were sprawling cities. You could live in New Jersey and travel to Manhattan. And those cities were actually made for cars and not for people. But today's city, you have a constraint of land, and therefore, your model of development has to be very different. And one of the challenges which we are facing as I get into this job is about creating, you know, if you follow the model of what America has done, what Europe has done, the same model requires 4 planet Earths, because cities consume a lot of natural resources. They consume 75% of the natural resources, and therefore, you need a very different model of growth. And one of the challenges which I'm handling now is this creation of 7 new industrial cities on the back of a dedicated freight corridor, which will put goods from Dadri close to Delhi to the JNPT port in 24 hours through a high-speed train, which today take about 12 to 13 days. Now, on the back of this, we are creating 7 new industrial cities. And these cities have been planned as smart cities, as cities. You know, India has been a very reluctant urbanizer. But if India has to move forward, it needs to use technology to make a quantum jump in its growth. And it needs to follow 2 different approaches. One is that we've tried to work with some of the best planners from across the world. If you look at the size and scale of these cities, this is probably one of the biggest urbanization processes taking place anywhere in the world. And the challenge is, how do you do development which is transit-oriented? Now, if you look at 2 cities, Atlanta and Barcelona, made at the same point of time in history, they cater to roughly the same population, 2.2 million. The CO2 emission in Atlanta is about 8 times more than Barcelona, simply because 97% of the people in Atlanta travel by car, whereas in Barcelona, about 66% of the people travel by mass transport, or they cycle, or they walk. So you have to make cities which are transit-oriented, where about 60% of the people travel by mass transportation, or they cycle, or they walk. Now, one of the first cities that we are doing is Dholera in Gujarat, which is over 540 square kilometer, one of the biggest developments in the world. We are doing another city in Pitampur, Dharmao. We are doing an industrial township near Dighi, over 253 square kilometer. We are doing a smaller development around Aurangabad, and we are doing a development around Rajasthan, which is planned by Jurong, and we are doing another development around Haryana. Now, to my mind, the key challenge of new industrialization, you know, if India has to grow at rates of 8 to 9%, manufacturing has to be a very key driver, but the logical consequence of manufacturing is urbanization. Now, to my mind, it's very important to use technology. And some of the great lessons of new urbanization come from not the western part of the world, but they come from eastern part of the world. They come from a city called Kitakyushu in Japan, where everything is recycled, which is one of the most advanced cities in terms of industrialization, but in the 70s, it decided to become a city for recycling. Everything is recycled. Great lesson in terms of water come from Singapore, where about 30% of the water is desalinated, 20% is recycled. Great lessons come in transportation from a city called Curitiba in Brazil. Great lessons come from Yokohama, where they save about 38%. They saved almost 38% of energy from better management of solid waste. But today, increasingly, designing of new cities, and it's a great challenge, designing of new cities is being driven by technology. What is being called a smart city by IBM, what is being called by Cisco a smart, intelligent, and connected cities, and what the Koreans are talking is the management of entire cities from their mobile network. And simply because Korea is very advanced, and actually new urbanization is being driven by new telephone companies, Korea Telecom, SK Telecom, etc. And therefore, it's very important to use technology because verticals, which Americans and European cities are driven by verticals of water, power, public safety, security. Today, technology, digital technology, enables you to cut across these verticals, create central command room, and manage from a central command room. And that's what great designing is all about. And therefore, if India has to make a quantum jump in urbanization, technology will have to be the key driver. And therefore, to my mind, while master planning is important, while development plans are important, because the transit-oriented development, the city must grow and evolve on the back of your public transportation system. But the key driver of all this will be new technology. How do you control the entire management of city from a central command room using digital technology? And that would be the key challenge. And therefore, some of these models that we are working around, one is at Sanand in Gujarat, where we are working with a range of leading companies on how do you recycle water, how do you treat solid waste, how do you use public transport, how do you do battery charge solutions, and so on. So these are some of the key challenges. To my mind, the key challenge for India is its ability to sustain rates of growth of 8 to 9% per annum over a very long period to be able to get its vast population above the poverty line. And for India to be able to achieve this rate on a sustained growth, urbanization will be the key driver. Urbanization will enable India to grow at rapid rates. Urbanization will enable India to create jobs. Urbanization, but it requires a smarter process of growth. It would require a very imaginative thinking. It would require designing for the future. It will require India to design cities which are far advanced and therefore can become the real role model for the rest of the world. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Amitabh. While there's a general belief that the bureaucracy runs in Brahmaloka time, where time stands still, it's amazing to see the kind of impact that you've created in all the projects you've taken so far. Next speakers, as you can see, I look like I'm flanked by Harold and Kumar, but the work that they do is very serious. They're principals at Surrey Architects, and they take elements that are most common and make it real. Up next, Christopher Lee.
Thank you very much. Originally, Kapil and I are supposed to make the presentation, and I think that's why Ram referred to us as Harold and Kumar, and we're going to do a 3D show. But nevertheless, Kapil and I set up a series about 3 years ago, and what we're going to talk to you about today is 3 projects grounded on certain of our interests and what I would call the common artifact. What grounds our approach to architecture and design? It's our firm belief and interest in finding the most common element within the city and to make them into works of art. To do this is to create artifacts in the city which are works of individuality but nevertheless embody what we call the common. This notion of the common can be found within the city precisely because the rarefied notion of the common, we believe, revalorize the profession of architecture or revalorize architecture as a discipline to have a societal role. because no sphere which is common to all than the city itself. And I would share with you what we mean by that with 3 projects, one in Mumbai, one in London, and one in China. So the first one, Precedent. The site that we were asked to look at is this racecourse site in Mumbai, in which there were a few disused sheds in which we had to preserve. And we thought what was most amazing about this site to preserve is actually not the shell of the building or the roof of the building, but in fact it's the volume that is created and is shaded by the majestic rain trees. And in fact, it's the most typical and most common characteristic within the site. So we thought instead of creating and preserving the building, could we begin to think of a volume that almost in a way draw a certain characteristic from this volume that is created by the trees. And the second common element that we find within the racecourse, which owes a certain heritage to colonial buildings and with regards to its shed structure, perhaps could be found in this wrought iron structure in Victoria Terminus, in which the structure is conceived as a flat section of steel plates. So in the sense that to bring these 2 moments, the flat section that is in a way creating a branch structure, that in a way is rotated in section that creates a large volume within the shed, thereby creating 2 spaces, one which is almost like a veranda space, and the other one which is more like a main space that is connecting within this 2. And thereby reimagining what would be a building structure. So for us here, the building structure almost becomes like branches, and the branches in a way becomes more and more thinner as they rise towards the ceiling, and as they begin to touch the ceiling, they turn into purlins, and the purlin turns into the old roof of the building, thereby creating a resonance with the site. And if you were to look at this ceiling plan, one could almost, you could almost not distinguish between what is the interior space that is created by this new addition, as well as the exterior space that is already in existence. And in that sense, to begin to create this layered space that makes a gradual transition between exterior space and an interior space. And also in the sense that this structure not only begins to create the ceiling space, but also creates overlays of intricacy, and also creates this moment in which what is the most common element within, or the most characteristic of the site is transposed into something completely new. The second project speaks about legacy. This is a project that we won in a competition, which should be completed in July. It's for the London 12 London Olympics. It is a pavilion for BMW. And when we were asked to enter this competition, to design the temporary pavilion for BMW, we went back straight to 4 years ago to Sebastian Coe's promise for the Olympic pavilions. Seb Coe promised 2 things for the London 2012 Olympics. The first one is that it will be a sustainable games. The second promise is the promise of legacy, that this game would leave behind a legacy not only to East Londoners, but to London as a whole. So, and of course, the pavilion will be held, the Olympics will be held in summer, so we begin to think of what do Londoners love to do the most in summer. And in that sense, this is what we love to do in London. That is to sit out in the park, gathering around a Victorian bandstand, and just to enjoy the outdoor space in nature. So our project, in a sense, re-envisioned the pavilion as 8 separate pavilions that comes together to form one large pavilion. It is made out of 8 separate pavilions that sits above what we call a water plinth, and in which within these different pavilions are housed the showcase cars. For instance, here is the BMW i, and in which these pavilions will float above a pool of water, and in which the water that is drawn from the river is clean, and then it's used to cool the building, and the clean water is then released back to the river. So in a sense, and also on the other side of the elevation of the building, because there is a slope, it creates a natural proscenium. And the natural proscenium, in a way, creates this amphitheater effect for the visitors for London 2012 Olympics. But most importantly, after the games, and this has to do with the question of legacy and is still in planning, is that these 8 separate pavilions would be dismantled and would be carried along one of the most iconic routes within London, and to be reused and placed in parks across London. And not only that, we can also imagine that these pavilions will reappear perhaps across landscape in England, or perhaps in Harris Rock, for instance. Sounds a bit far-fetched, but I think it holds a very powerful image. And perhaps also like Anthony Gormley, where he turns a whole beach into a work of art by punctuating it with the cast of his body. The same could be said, for instance, in the placement of this pavilion within a beach setting. So the last project I want to show with you deals with the question of continuity. It is a project in Xi'an, China. It is also a competition project that we were approached to do. We were asked to look at the site at the northeast corner of the city of Xi'an, which is a very historical city. The brief was very simple. We were asked to actually just create 5 separate pavilions onto this master plan that was created by another architect as a greenhouse that would anchor the growth of the city in the periphery. But when we visited the site, we were completely taken by the city wall. And this city wall actually stretches for 24.3 kilometers, in which the city wall, although the city has grown and has exceeded the city wall, the sense of centrality that the city wall gives to the inhabitants of the city is still very powerful, we felt. And in a sense, we think that could we begin to rethink a large artifact of the city that could also do the same for the northeast corner of the site, that is to give a sense of centrality to a splintering site. So therefore, we wanted to, in a way, recuperate or revalidate the tradition of city making in China using large artifacts. So we started by rethinking the wall. Instead of a closed wall, we thought of it as an open wall. An open wall that is punctuated at 3 points with 2 squares and 1 tower designed by a Chinese architect. So the project presents itself as a 1 kilometer long bridge and wall, and in a way creates this artifact that gives a new centrality to the northeast corner of Xi'an, and in which it's no longer a city wall that repels, but a city wall that creates circulation and pedestrian on top of the wall and also across the wall. And in a sense, becomes a wall also that touches very, very lightly on the landscape that it sits on. And not only that, where the old city wall is used to repel and to exclude, the wall here is inclusive. What does it include? It includes 5 climatic zones in which one could experience the 5 climatic zones almost in a sequence of episodes, in contrast and almost in stark contrast with the landscape that is existing within the site. So therefore, for us, this project in a way demonstrates a way in which we begin to choose or to draw from the most common element in the city and to transform it into an artifact that is very special, and to, in a way, draw a continuity between past and present, and therefore revalorize architecture to have a societal role. Thanks.
Thanks, Christopher. Up next, we have Alex White, who was an urban planner for Hong Kong's Central Waterfront and Barcelona's public spaces. And when he landed in New York, he quit his job and became an artist. 370 paintings later, he decided to combine urban planning and art to start artifacting. And he's going to talk to us about some of his projects.
So there's clearly master planning, and then there's micro planning, which in an age of drastic urbanization happening at such a fast rate, it's seeming to become a more and more critical need. You see do-it-yourself, you see social practice taken by the artists, in terms of artists who are engaging communities at a micro level, to not forget about the people as we accelerate towards and past 7 billion. So what is artifacting? Artifacting is about embedding itself in communities. It's about engaging these communities. It's about understanding these communities. It's about grabbing onto the grassroots that exist in every community and allowing those communities to develop and recognize themselves. So I'll present you 2 case studies that artifacting has accomplished. The first one was in Dharavi. We spent 3 months in Dharavi. Dharavi is known as a very dangerous place. It's known as Asia's most notorious slum, the world's largest slum, but it's also known as a place of incredible entrepreneurship. It's known as a place that recycles the waste of Bombay. But in Bombay, many people were telling us that that's a place we shouldn't step foot into, that it's dangerous, that it's best to stay away. But how do you develop a city if you're pushing neighborhoods away from one another? Our approach was immersion. If we want to understand places, you have to actually get in them and understand what they're all about. So we spent 3 months living and working in Dharavi, letting ourselves adapt and change to what Dharavi actually is, to who these people are, to what their lives are like, and what survival in a context of what the struggle for survival is actually like. So over the course of 3 months, actually in the first month in this immersion, we really became closer and closer to the people as we adapted and changed and really were able to push ourselves beyond kind of the cacophonous noise that typically surrounds you and start to understand what those noises are actually all about. It's the dynamics of recycling. It's the dynamics of an economy. It's the dynamics of a society happening in front of your eyes if you can sensitize yourself enough to actually understand what is going on around you. And that's what we were able to do after the first month. We had friendships. We built relationships with the people around us. And it was as much about us learning about who these people were as it was for them understanding who we were. After the first month, we moved into a phase which we called intervention. Intervention meaning pushing beyond the relationships that we had developed and actually starting to be proactive in someone else's community to see how they're going to respond to us. We used art as the methodology or as the medium. And we started off by doing murals. Here you see a welcome mural that we painted. And we painted without knowing how people were going to respond to us. We thought this is really going to be the test to see to what degree these white people or this arts collaborative group is really going to be accepted in this community. And to our surprise, people really embraced that. And to our surprise, these murals started to act as windows of communication that allowed people to learn about us and vice versa. And as this building of bridges occurred between Westerners of privilege and people from all over India together in Dharavi fighting for survival, as these bridges occurred and we got closer, there was more and more requests that our artistic services be used specifically for their purpose. So I started making walla signs. People were saying, after making a mural, all the energy from the people was driving us to make more and more murals. And someone said, why don't you paint something on my shed? So in the idea of Dharavi being as kind of a stigmatized, stereotyped place, the idea was to make walla signs to give indication of what's the activity going on behind that blighted wall, so to speak, and to give a little bit of recognition to these people that live every day in and day out here in Dharavi. So here you see bakery walla. We did a chai walla. We did a sign for Chan, the local barber. And then Chan liked that, so he made his own, even better, signage, haircutting salon. We did pipe walla to give recognition for someone who's been in Dharavi for 60 years, refurbishing auto pipes. We did one for chicken walla. So over the course, this was about, I think, the second month at this time, over the course of this whole immersion, the locals became as part of the project as we were. The project was really beginning to grab onto these grassroots that I mentioned and become something of experimental, sure, because the distance of the gap between us and them was so big, but alive in its essence. And so we had the idea, this place is nothing like it felt when I first stepped foot in here. This place is actually bringing terms such as social wealth to mind, or we're comparing the happiness of people here as to the happiness of my neighbor in New York who's been living by himself for 60 years. And we wanted to share kind of these sensations and this experience with other people. So we launched the 13th Compound exhibition. 13th Compound exhibition was an 18-stop exhibition taking people through the workspaces, through the sleeping quarters of Dharavi to see the place for itself, but under the name of art. And in the 13th Compound exhibition, we used, as you see here, there's some paintings, there's experimental film, but all within the context of Dharavi. Art that is about the environment that surrounds them, art that meshes with the environment around them, art that becomes the place in itself, and the place becomes the art. So we had about 500 visitors that came from all walks of life, from Bombay and beyond, into Dharavi, many for the first time, many ashamed for the stereotypes they had held before stepping into a slum for their first time, which was a huge intention of the project. Here you see in a recycling shop short films about the recycling industry being shown to locals and to visitors. Here you have photography. And here we have one of the responses to the project, which were locals that over the course of 2 months and watching us do our thing, making paintings, making sculpture, just observing, people started to make their own crafts. And these two people came out on the day of the exhibition to exhibit their work themselves. So upon returning to New York after this 3-month immersion and quite energized from the energy that people of Dharavi had given us, we decided to continue on. We exhibited the project at the Queen's Museum of Art, and the director suggested that we look towards the Dharavi of the West. And this is a place called Willets Point. Willets Point is similar to Dharavi on the verge of being redeveloped by the city. It's a place seen as blighted. It's a place seen as tragic and of very little value. Yet it's a place that people know very little about. As you can see, this is the urban landscape. So you see potholes, you see lots of signs. This is actually a car economy that serves the region. People travel from up to 3 hours away to have their car services here because they can actually afford this, whereas they cannot afford to go to a proper auto shop. This is a place where you have people of about 50 different nationalities, including India, converging here to make a living. And it's a place that works in the literal sense of economy. These are shops that lend labor from one shop to another to come together to, as a whole, to develop itself. Without the aid of the city, because infrastructure, much like Dharavi, is not being provided to them. So what it is the social unification and the economic unification of these people that serves to help everyone out. So as you see, there's all cars end up here, and you have skills that take these cars apart, recycling parts and renovating parts. Very entrepreneurial. So in this project, we were kind of waiting to hatch the egg. As we were going into this culture and getting to know the people, mostly of a Hispanic background, a Middle Eastern background, and kind of feeling out their culture, because that's in the end how you understand a place, we said to ourselves, okay, how do we show this to the outside world? And how can we, what are the assets here that we can actually manifest? Art is just that, in my opinion. It is the manifestation of something that is there, but may not be seen. So we found a junkyard. There's lots of junkyards there, but this was an empty plot of land that was absolutely in disuse. Looking around, we said these cultures are, all these people love, what do they love? They love football. So we organized a 24-team tournament in which all different mechanic shops could play up against one another in what would be a celebration for the community. And for the outsiders, it would be a way to see who these people really were, and an opportunity to see the community that existed below that skin of so-called blight that we see all the time in the media. So here's a little shot of what happened when we turned a junkyard into what's now known as El Estadio. So that was nothing more than an empty plot of land that, just by bringing people together and realizing who they were and what bound them together, a piece of infrastructure was made. And going back there a month later, we found that the lines were actually painted and that goals were actually constructed, and that 3 tournaments have happened since. And even now there's a proper signage for the stadium, which continues to be used. So a piece of one of the projects I presented, the Dharavi project, can actually be seen outside, and we made it from the refuse of Anish Kapoor, and the idea of the sculpture is Dharavi as a beehive, which is just an example of how we try to launch other perspectives to make people think twice about where they are. So, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So since we're running out of time, I'll just pose one question for all our panelists, and then you can all participate in the debate as well. Amitabh, you're seen as one of the key promoters of the PPP model, the public-private partnership model, and DMIC is a classic example of that. What are the immediate challenges that you see with regards to this?
See, when urbanization took place across the world, across America, across Europe, across China, Japan, it was all created through state funding. State was the key driver. But it's just going to be a very different process as far as India is concerned. The challenge for India is that, almost 70% of the infrastructure, and India's infrastructure story has just begun. Our urbanization story has just begun, and in the next 3 to 4 decades, India will actually be creating more infrastructure than what it has done in the last 5,000 years. So actually, we'll be creating a completely new India in the next 4 decades. And therefore, to my mind, 70% of the infrastructure will be through the private-public partnership. And the challenge there is that government must be able to structure projects well. When it puts out projects into the market, they should be extremely sophisticatedly dealt with. That means all the clearances must be in place, and they must be put out into the market. But what it entails is that you'll see better designing, because most of these projects would be on design, build, operate, and transfer basis over a long period. So you will see the skills of the private sector coming in. You will see better designing, you will see better operation, you will see better management, and you will see better financing of these projects.
Thank you. Great promises for the future then. So to Chris and Kapil, what are the challenges that you faced when comparing your projects between China and India? I didn't want to do this, but a lot of people did want me to ask about that, considering that you were presenting one project that you've done in India, one in China.
Well, it's about speed, right? I mean, here things are just too slow, and there things are just too fast. So I think, basically, clearly, also in terms of, I would say, regulatory processes. I mean, in China, most of our projects are kind of, let's say, government projects, and they're very aggressive in terms of actually pushing them through and, ensuring that they're completed very, very quickly. So in that sense, it's quite encouraging for young design firms like us, because we actually get to see our work actually coming up pretty quickly. In India, on the other hand, most of the projects we've done have taken up to 5 years, even small projects. And I think, all, in my peer group is where we kind of share those frustrations of, this kind of endless, let's say, red tape, and how long it takes to actually see something. And I think, yeah, that's probably one of the key differences between India and China.
I think maybe to combine two questions together, because I think what Amita is saying is very interesting. And I want to respond to 2 questions. Because in a sense, I think what's exciting, as Amita has said, that in the next 4 decades, we will see large or great urbanization happening in India. And the way I see it is that a lot of the approach towards infrastructure and towards planning, especially in China and also in India to a large extent, is driven predominantly by planning through land use and infrastructure as a means of management. And I think within that, I think there is a missing trick. And I think that trick is really to reinstate the primacy of the question of the city. Now, what I mean by the primacy of the question of the city is because, as we know, the process of urbanization that is driven especially by PPP or by the private sector usually is driven with the interests of economics and with the interests of profit making. That is also to say that the process of urbanization may not necessarily create spaces, artifacts, buildings that are ultimately civic in character. And it is precisely architecture, spaces, and places that are civic in character that gives urban spaces meaning, that gives urban spaces a certain commonality. And I think it's quite important, I think, in a sense, and in that sense, our challenge as well, working in China and also in India, perhaps in this sort of scale, is to really ask, how can architecture play this role, right? To reimagine or to ask again, what to us is the idea of the city?
You know, there's 3 points which I want to add on. One is that when you're doing new urbanization, it's very critical that government must create the trunk infrastructure. That is civic spaces, the drainage, the sewage, the solid waste, and the transport mobility system. The rest of the PPP grows on that. In fact, it becomes commercially viable if the non-commercial component, which to my mind is about 35% of the project, of the program, is done by the government. Now, to my mind, this requires a great level of very high ability of government to be able to do good detailed designing, bring in very high-skilled program management, which is absent. Thirdly, our ability to monetize land value. To my mind, urbanization is a function of your ability to depoliticize land and monetize land value and capture the enhanced land value into the city itself. That is the key.
Thank you. That was a very important issue that you brought out there. Thank you, Amitabh. Alex, so you're working on what are the cultural issues with urbanization, right? So what is the next project that you're going to tackle?
Well, it fits in nicely with the conversation. The next project we'll be heading, we're actually leaving on Sunday, is the engagement of urbanization in Northeast India. So I think we know, along with urbanization comes almost, at times, a sterilization. Architecture that begins to come from many places, cultures that start to evolve and seep into a place. So we're actually going to Guwahati, and we'll be based in Guwahati for 3 months. We're doing an arts and ecology residency that's very much about taking artists back into the tribes, back into the hills to understand the roots of their culture. And it's also about creating art. It's about creating music that may have evolved from those tribal original roots, but at least has that thread, at least can understand where it's coming from, and at least can show that it is linked to the heritage of the place. Because that's really our concern, is to counter, in ways, the after effects of urbanization and what urbanization seems to be doing to places all over the world. I mean, for me, it's come from being in Hong Kong, for example, and I'm looking at these glass skyscrapers and saying, well, this might as well be New Jersey, and not feeling that sense of place. And that's, I think, because the culture hasn't been planned for. It hasn't really come in at an early enough process to really allow itself to evolve. And I think to lose our culture is to lose our identity. So we're really looking to take these ideas into context of Northeast India for the span of three months, working with different local partners, working with 5 international artists, 15 international artists, all under the same roof, starting with dialogue, again, starting with immersion, and the output will be, what is the Northeast now?
Thanks, Alex. So we're about to run out of time, so anybody who's got questions in the audience, please, up here first. And there.
Really, the question is to Amitabh. How are you integrating design into this infrastructure projects? I mean, this government always has these tender processes. Yes, they'll get into it, and it's supposed to be design B or B, and many B operate, whatever. So how is design coming into that? How are we going to be ensured of aesthetically beautiful spaces that actually fulfill the needs of those citizens?
Yeah. Actually, one of the things I deliberately showed in the slides was the kind of master planners who are working with us, from AECOM to CH2M to Halcro to Jurong of Singapore. The best planners from across the world who've designed new cities are actually working with us. I'm not a great believer in the concept of L1, that is the lowest cost. So I work on a very different principle. And I work on the principle which has now been approved by the government, and that is called quality come cost. So I give 80% marks on quality and 20%. You can't equate the painting of M.F. Hussain with my painting. It would be absurd. So, good creativity, good innovation, good design, and definitely good master planning and good designing has to get a premium. And therefore, we work with the best planners from across the world. We grade them on a scale of 80 marks and then give pricing only 20 marks. And therefore, the best people, and we plan to work with the best architects from across who've delivered similar cities across the world.
Hi. This is actually sort of a build on the question last asked, again to Amitabh. On the panel, we've heard, on one end, sort of this macro planning with regards to urban design, which is targeting 8 to 9% growth. And then, on the other extreme is Alex presenting projects where trying to engage with specific communities and trying to create habitats that respond to that. And I think the question there to you, Amitabh, is can you give us a window into the planning process which incorporates some of those principles? And how are you steering that? How is the planning that you are steering right now responding to needs of communities at the very, very sort of grassroots level?
To my mind, sprawling cities are dead. The American model is dead. And the earlier we wipe it out, it's better, simply because you just don't have the natural resources to make sprawling cities. So you need to create, there's so much of pressure on land, on gas, on water. And if you follow the American model, you'll need 4 planet Earth. You just have 1 planet Earth. So what do? You've got to create cities which are compact, which are dense, which are vertical, but are great cities to live, work, and play. That is the challenge. And what do you do when you do this? There are 2 things which I said. One is your cities must evolve on a mass transit system. There must be transit-oriented development, and the affordable housing must be the first plank of your development. Affordable housing holds the key. If you do not do this, large contractors will come in, create slums, and therefore affordable housing, and we've worked around 4 to 5 different models, and there's a whole different ball game of presentation, which will take me hours to go through. But affordable housing, recycling of water, building in sewage, building in your utility corridor, and for me, the crux of new urbanization is creating the trunk infrastructure on the back of which the rest of the city grows. So you must have drainage, you must have water. You can't have the Gurgaon model being repeated again and again where you don't have public transportation. So you need water, you need electricity, you need solid waste, and you need good technology through that utility corridor. So you need to bring in real-time governance and control of that city through technology. You see, why it's very important is because I'm on a job where I'm not retrofitting. You must understand that. I'm on a job which the challenge for me is to do greenfield new urbanization. Retrofitting becomes extremely difficult. It's a very, very complicated, very, very difficult process. And in retrofitting, you have to take very different aspect, a very different approach. I'm speaking from my experience. And retrofitting requires you to take a whole lot of challenges, different challenges. But for me, the challenge is how do you make a city which is a great city to live, work, and play, and don't create the same mistakes which have happened in other parts of the world. And to my mind, the cultural component and the architectural design has to be very closely interwoven with the social fabric of that particular area and that particular region. So actually, the architectural design and the master planning has taken into consideration. There's been a whole lot of stakeholders consultation. So if you go to Dholera, we've done about 80 rounds of interaction with the farmers. I mean, it's a wasteland, one single crop, but 80 different rounds. If you go to Rajasthan, where water is a very challenge, where we are recharging the aqueducts, it's a very different challenge. So every city is providing a very different challenge. But the challenge is to work with the people.
Just to add on your comments, I mean, I think new urbanization is a special challenge because you're creating a city from nothing, from absolutely nothing. And I think, furthermore, the challenge may be how to incite a spirit of a city. Everyone who's gone to a special place knows that that place has its identity. And you know that you probably are challenged to describe exactly what it is. But that is almost a collective identity of a people that comes out by those people feeling invested in that place. in that city, calling it home. Home enough in which they can actually create within it. They can be who they are within it and exude that to the environment, the built environment around them. And I think what's important is having conduits that allow these people, once active as communities and as a population, to then be seen and serve as assets rather than a class of people. They should be seen as the assets of the city.
I think the key aspect is that when you design cities, you design for human beings. And therefore, the very high level, you need to take the cultural context, you need to interact with the people around, and you need to take the existing living condition, and you need to interact with them at great length to be able to design a city where human beings will find it exciting, will find it adventurous, and will find it a great city to live, work, and play.
Thank you all. I think that was a pretty interesting session for the Ultra Snooze session, right? So we're all going to be available during the break. So please feel free to reach us with any of your questions. We are definitely going to keep the debate going offline. So look forward to having you participate as well. Thank you.